It's a great note. You know it's not used a lot. This is my musical good taste. Charlie, Starkist doesn't want things with good taste. And sorry, Charlie.
So we are doing a special episode, even though, as we said, we want to do our show every other Thursday because we have a lot of life responsibilities and whatnot, and we wanted to not be so tied down to the news cycle. However, last week something happened that we absolutely had to make an episode about because it's something that hits so close to home for us for several reasons. And obviously, we are talking about this latest Republican PR stunt of moving migrants from Texas mainly to northern blue states like New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut. So this is something that has been happening already with the Texas governor, Greg Abbott. He's the one that's made this a fundamental part of his brand of conservatism. This is, his publicity strategy nationally is, look how I'm busing migrants from the border towns in Texas to northern states. Let's see how the liberals like the migrants in their states, because they claim that Joe Biden has an open border policy. Most of these migrants, Edu, as we have discussed before, are Venezuelan because 21st century socialism is one of the main causes that are leading people to show up at the U.S.-Mexican border. Not only Venezuelans, but Nicaraguans and Cubans are showing up at record numbers. So most of these migrants that the Texas governor has been moving from Texas to New York mostly this summer are Venezuelan. We have been seeing this all summer. But last week, the Trump wannabe Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, got in on the scheme because it has been so popular about with the MAGA crowd that's fundamentally anti-migration, and the Florida governor used Florida's money to charter 2 planes from Texas to Martha's Vineyard. And the idea was, what is the richest, bluest area that we can send these migrants to? And of course, Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts is one of these places where the world's elite has homes. President Obama has a home there. So cheered by Republicans and most disgustingly by many Venezuelans, Ron DeSantis sent about 50 Venezuelan migrants to Martha's Vineyard. They had no idea where they were. Many of them told the press that a woman had approached them in a Texas shelter, telling them that if they got on the plane, they would be going to Boston, where they could get work permits. So this is human trafficking, isn't it?
Yeah, the thing about the Republican Party, hey everyone, welcome to From the North. The thing about the Republican Party in Venezuela, it's something that is concerning. It's not the first time that we've talked about this. Basically, I would say that's part of the reason why we started this podcast to begin with. This is one of the reasons we started talking. We met each other over Twitter talking about these issues. And like you said before, our focus on this season was going to be more cultural, more generic, but this is very close to us. So yeah, this is the issue with the Republican Party and Venezuela. Republicans love using Venezuela as something to scare the voters of the United States with. Nowadays, socialism is a word that has been used so much by so many people that it doesn't really mean anything anymore. But the way the Republicans use it is, again, to scare the voters into not voting blue, into not voting Democrats. So they love talking about Venezuela. They love talking about Cuba, the dictatorship, the famine, the corruption.
By the way, that's a big reason, sorry, Edu, that they have done so well electorally in Florida ever since primarily Trump. He kind of took up this cause.
Yeah. And although they claim to care about the people of Venezuela and they love saying how much they care about our suffering and the things that we've gone through. Remember, biggest refugee crisis in the world. 6.8 million Venezuelans are refugees right now, including yours truly. Yet, when these vulnerable migrants come into the United States looking for a better future, looking for work, looking for job opportunities,
and asking for asylum, Edu. This is very important to point it out, because it is not illegal to show up at the U.S.-Mexico border to ask for asylum.
No, that it's an international right. Everyone has it. And particularly Venezuelans who are going through what they're going through should have, at the very least, their asylum claims heard. So anyway, these people show up to the border and then the Republicans start dehumanizing them immediately. No longer they care about Venezuelans. Now they become illegal aliens, criminals, and they ship them away to northern states, spending millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to make a point.
That
and playing
phrase,
with the livelihood of vulnerable people.
The illegal aliens phrase, like, it just hit me when you said that, because I just saw a Ted Cruz tweet saying this. One of the Republicans, a Latino, who constantly talks about the Venezuelan tragedy, now calling these people illegal aliens.
So do they really care about Venezuela? Do they really care about Venezuelans? I don't know. Doesn't look like it. Definitely not. But it also speaks to the wider political framework in which Venezuelans are situated right now. Let's talk about like Venezuelan voters, for example, now in the United States. Venezuelan Americans. These are people that have been calling out the issue of the Venezuelan dictatorship, of Venezuelan socialism for decades now. And they were largely ignored by both parties up until 2016 when Trump came along and started galvanizing that people, talking about Venezuela, which a lot of Venezuelans really liked because they were ignored all this time.
Not only Venezuelans, Edu, he found a good talking point. I mean, it was a good one, and it hadn't been used by anyone before on either side, which just goes to show why it was so strongly received by the Venezuelan community when finally someone spoke about it. And as we've mentioned plenty of times in this show, it's a good case to bring up. We have a country that was rich, that was destroyed by bad policies and corruption. I mean, it was ready for the taking, especially for a character and a populist like Trump.
Yeah. It's just a very good populist talking point. Do not vote blue because you are going to end up like the people of Venezuela.
Helped also, Edu, sorry, but by the characters that we always talk about, AOC, Bernie Sanders, that makes it easier to make that point. As we always say in this show, not all Democrats are that, but the addition and the newfound prominence of these characters all came together to make that a good argument for the GOP.
And they don't help themselves. Like, I remember back in 2020 when they were having the Democratic primaries for the presidency, very early stages, people didn't know if Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders was going to end up being the candidate. And I remember at a debate where they were pressing on the issue of Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, etc. Back then, that was like the surge of radical Venezuelan Americans who like went down the rabbit hole of republicanism and Trumpism. Not republicanism, but like Trumpism. And I remember hearing like Bernie Sanders saying something in the lines of, we gotta talk. Yes, Cuba is a bad place. Yes, Cuba is a dictatorship, but they have a good healthcare system. They have a good education system, which is all bullshit.
Some of the biggest fireworks erupting when Sanders was pressed on whether a self-described democratic socialist would give a free pass to authoritarian leaders.
I have opposed authoritarianism all over the world.
But Sanders again doubled down on his praise for the late Cuban dictator Fidel Castro.
I said is what Barack Obama said in terms of Cuba, that Cuba made progress on education. Yes, I think, really? Really?
This
and
isn't a
he was
national
booed.
debate, so I mean, it's not hard to make the point. Look, a real socialist is on a presidential debate for the Democrats. I mean,
And like he was booed in that stage.
I think it
He
was even
like,
in Miami, Edu. I think that might have been 2016. But
maybe
it was
I'm not 100% sure.
craziness.
I'm not, but like, come on, like read the room. And when you see that happening in the Democratic debate, you're only gonna scare people out. Like the few people that maybe were on the verge of voting blue or voting red, just scare them out of voting blue entirely. Even though Joe Biden ended up winning, even though most Americans, most Democratic voters, decided going with a more moderate option, which is a long shot from socialism. And I think I can speak with property about this, and you can speak with property about this, and anyone who like really understands economics and politics and socialism can tell you that Joe Biden is not a socialist. But the message still struck. And now we're seeing that same party, the same party who were promising, or like not promising, but they were saying that they were going to be strong against Maduro, that all the options were on the table, that they're going to sanction the country, that they're going to liberate Venezuela. Now that they have the victims of that socialist regime knocking at their door, now what we are. We're no longer freedom fighters.
Right.
We're no longer victims of socialism. We're illegal migrants. We're aliens. We're dehumanized for a political purpose. So that's the whole hypocrisy of the Republican Party.
And it's not
They don't
new
care about
hypocrisy,
Venezuela. They never
Edu, because we have seen this hypocrisy since this whole debate started in 2016 once Trump started bringing things up. Once Trump became president, he never gave TPS to Venezuelans. That was a big rallying cry that Joe Biden said he would do. By the way, they did pass it, but I keep seeing that Venezuelans are not actually getting this protected status. So the whole situation is a mess in every way. As Edu just said, Venezuela is now officially the world's largest refugee crisis, tied with Ukraine. Now, of course, Venezuela is not in active war technically. So this is a very specific man-made crisis that has thousands and tens of thousands of Venezuelans leaving every month. Now, it's incredibly underfunded, and that's why we are seeing that there are no resources to allocate these refugees and migrants anywhere. They have already overwhelmed neighboring countries in South America. Now they are moving north, crossing the very, very dangerous Guardian Gap to walk countries to get to the United States. Now they get to the US-Mexico border, and the same politicians that have been touting our tragedy are getting them on a plane or a bus under random pretenses and dropping them off randomly. Ew, some other migrants were dropped in front of Kamala Harris's house. I mean, it's not even hid in any way that this is anything more than a political stunt. And you know what's sad? And now we have to talk about the next thing. We have discussed in this show how Trump's support for Venezuelan democracy created fanatical supporters among the Venezuelan community. Well, I was surprised, Edu, that last week when I was talking against the human rights violations by these two Republican governors, who did I receive the most hate from? Other Venezuelans.
We are a sick nation. We've been broken in so many different ways. And I think one of the symptoms of that is the hatred that many Venezuelans have for their own people.
But Edu, I was wondering, is this something specific to us? Or I was wondering, is this something that also happened to, for example, the Cuban exile? I mean, I'm trying to study it, like, is this normal when like a society goes through what we have gone through? Like, because I'm trying to understand the response.
So there is historical examples of the first migrants looking down on the second migrants from the same from the same country. Like the same thing happened in the 19th century in the United States with Irish migrants and Scottish migrants, right? Like the first ones to come or to go to the United States were the wealthiest, the ones who migrated because they wanted to migrate, because they have the means
Well,
to
all
migrate
migrations
and start a
from
new
crises
business.
are like that. It's the same in Venezuela. The first people who were able to leave were the ones that could leave in plane. Now we're 20 years later. Now the people who are coming are walking here.
They're walking from Venezuela. Like if you guys, I know that most of you are familiar with Venezuela if you're not from Venezuela, but at least you know where it is on a map. But look it up on Google Maps and see how far these people are walking from. They're crossing dangerous jungles that in which they're being trafficked by gangs, in which they're being murdered, in which they're being raped, in which they're being kidnapped, and then they have to keep walking through all the countries of Central America, and then outwards to Mexico, and then to the Rio Grande. Many of those Venezuelans are drowning.
Yeah,
It's horrible.
We have had
But
horrible
back-
stories this summer, and it's like, again, I want to mention it because as a Venezuelan, and I'm sure you have seen it too, like over the last months, we have been inundated with images of our fellow Venezuelan people literally drowning and struggling as they cross the river. Like this is on the news every day for months. So
Yeah.
it's go ahead.
This is a sad episode to make, but nonetheless, we figured that we had to make it. Back to the point. This hatred of those first wave of Venezuelan migrants towards the second wave of Venezuelan migrants. I don't know which wave this is. This is like the fifth, sixth wave of migrants that we've had, but it's certainly the most critical one in the sense that this is the first time that we've seen massive amount of Venezuelan people like moving into the United States from the southern border. Obviously, these are people with the least amount of resources compared to the people that came before and could afford a plane ticket. And more important than a plane ticket, could actually afford to be proven for a tourist visa.
Or
Which is
a
something that
lawyer
not a lot of,
once they got here.
or a lawyer, which is something that not a lot of people know. Even other Venezuelans that I've talked to, Venezuelans that are privileged, don't really know this. And not saying that it's bad that they're privileged, but it is bad that you don't understand this. But in Venezuela, applying for a visa, for a U.S. visa, which is the only way to get into the United States with a plane ticket, 95% of the people are being rejected.
But what about
So
even
only
getting a
those-
passport? Even getting a Venezuelan passport, you can't do without some sort of connection or cash.
Correct. And it's one of the most expensive passports in the world. We're talking about a broken nation, a failed state, charging $200 plus for a passport legally, because you're never going to get it that way. You have to pay someone inside, because corruption, obviously, to get a passport for like thousands of dollars. So now that we're seeing those who don't have the means to seek refuge with plane, walking all the way up to Mexico, crossing into their border, and now these people that came before don't like them. And that's another thing that's really embedded into Venezuelan culture, which is one of the issues that we talked about many times in the past. But if Venezuela has an issue in its society, it's classism. And it's something that it works all across
I think
Latin
Latin America, and I would even say the world. I'm like careful with saying that like this is a particular Venezuelan thing. I don't think it is. I think if anything, it's a Latin American thing, but we see it everywhere, really.
Yeah, but in Venezuela, it is especially strong. And now this is a reflection of what we're seeing. This is just an extension of classism. The people who used to live in Caracas, in the good neighborhoods, and look down at the people that lived in the barrios, the poor communities, now that those people fled into the United States, some by plane, some by walking into it, we're seeing the same dynamic. And not only this is not even the first time that we're seeing this during this refugee crisis. We've seen this happening when the crisis started and Venezuelans migrated to other parts of South America. In Colombia, the wealthy Venezuelans that migrated to Colombia hated the fact that poor Venezuelans were coming into the country. Same with Peru, same with Ecuador, same with Chile, especially with Chile. You see a lot of Venezuelans in Chile who were celebrating when they started closing the border to Venezuelan refugees.
No.
Even though there was absolutely no difference between the people that came before and the people that came after, other than the ones that came before were lucky enough to be able to make the trip on a plane before Venezuelans were asked to get a visa to enter Chile. So, this is just a sad reality in which our society is in. And to make things worse, we have politicians taking advantage of it.
I thought, now I kind of put two and two together. It's very interesting because what you were just saying, you know, about how hard it is for Venezuelans to get documents with living in a basically failed, corrupt, socialist nation. It's all tied together. Like all the things these Republican politicians denounce about what ruined Venezuela and about 21st century socialism. But then on the side, they say, no, we do want migrants. We just want them to do it legally. Well, because of all the things you just said about how Venezuela was destroyed, they cannot do it legally. They literally, most people cannot get a passport. It is not an option for these people to show up at an embassy and do it the right way. There is no right way when, as Republicans like to mention, a country has been destroyed by a leftist dictatorship. It all ties together.
And we go to something else, which is and this not only applies to Venezuelans, but it applies to every migrant that's illegal in terms of the legality, I guess, of the United States. They say that migrants take money away, that migrants spend taxpayers' money in social programs that are meant to help them by sending their kids to school, healthcare, food, shelter, whatever. But what's the issue? That you're forcing these people when you're not giving them documents, or when you don't want to give them documents, these people are going to still come into your country and they're going to work illegally and they're not going to pay taxes. If you give papers to these people, they're going to pay taxes. So if you want to really help Venezuelans out, instead of keep calling them aliens and illegals and sending them to states just to prove a political point, why don't you make a streamline so they can actually migrate legally and work and pay taxes? Because let me tell you something about someone who has lived under a socialist regime and has experienced hunger firsthand and has experienced relying upon a government that just wants you dead. These people want to work, and they want to work harder than anyone else because they will be thankful for the opportunity to actually make a living by doing whatever it is that they want to do or they can't do. Instead of that, instead of helping them, instead of giving them papers, instead of saying, you know what, stay here in Texas, help us build the economy, help us build infrastructure. No, you're going to be shipped away in a bus like cattle to a northern state just because I want to, again, push some buttons, like we said on our previous episode.
You know what's particularly upsetting to me? Like, just how they love Trump. A big part of the Venezuelan community loves Ron DeSantis, who was actively preventing Venezuelans to get to Florida. Because what a lot of the people, the Venezuelans who were bused to New York City, actually, I guess the Texas governor is the one that sent them to New York. DeSantis, I think, so far has only sent them to Massachusetts. But regardless, these people were not trying to be in the north. Where are most Venezuelans trying to go? Florida. That's where they know people. That's where they have resources. That's in Miami where everyone speaks Spanish. That's an easier place to start for them. And instead, the Florida governor and the Texas governor are sending them to northern states where, I mean, what connection can have... It makes me so sad to imagine a Venezuelan mom stepping out of this bus in Martha's Vineyard. Like, imagine it. Like, there must have been like, where the fuck am I? And it's actually funny to me that the super liberals in Martha's Vineyard did not react how the Republicans were hoping they would react. They actually stepped up to the play, tried to give them food and shelter. They even let out high school kids for AP Spanish so they could help translate, because of course these migrants didn't speak English. I mean, it's just enraging. There were even kids that have been moved to the north where these people don't know anywhere and don't have any connections. But then we're gonna have Venezuela vote for Ron DeSantis in Florida. I mean, it makes no sense to me. Not only that, Edu, but it's so stupid to do what these Venezuelans are doing when they're speaking out against their fellow countrymen. I don't know if you have seen, but a lot of the comments that I got under an op-ed that I wrote about this, against this, was videos that Venezuelans say are Venezuelan criminals moving to the US. They are now spreading the fake news that Maduro is letting prisoners out of the jails in Venezuela to send them to the United States, and in that way, you know, cause issues here. These people don't realize that to an American, to Venezuelans, it doesn't matter which neighborhood you lived in Caracas, to the American, you're both the same. And if you're spreading the idea that the Venezuelans who come here are criminals, the people who are from here are not going to make a difference between you and the poor Venezuelan. You're both the same to them. So you're screwing us all up. I was born here, and this idea that the Venezuelans that are coming here are criminals affects me too. It doesn't matter your migration status. So it's literally attacking ourselves, what's going on.
And it's not, and again, we go back to Latin America, which was the first like part of the world that saw this Venezuelan refugee crisis happening. This was the same thing that like anti-migrant politicians from the left and from the right, because Latin America, like, regardless of which part of the spectrum you're on, it seems that none of them like Venezuelan migrants. This is the same rhetoric that they were using, that Maduro was releasing prisoners.
By the way, it's the same rhetoric the leftist mayor of Bogota, Claudia, whatever, uses. So as you said, this is not right or left. It's the oldest excuse in the book, blame the migrants.
They've been saying this in Peru, they've been saying this in Colombia, and again, left-wing politicians, right-wing politicians, center politicians, like no one gives a shit about Venezuelans. We're all being used for political tools. Now we're seeing this in the United States. It's just the next stage of it, because we have a refugee crisis that's ongoing and it is not going to stop, because contrary to popular belief, contrary to what a lot of people have been saying, that Venezuela is recovering, that Venezuela is getting to a good place economically, yes, this is happening in a very tiny fraction of the Venezuelan population. The top 5%, the top 10% of Venezuelans that get to live in a nice neighborhood in Puerto La Cruz, in Maracaibo, in Caracas, are the ones that are experiencing this betterment, which is not really, because there are a lot of things that come along with that. But the vast majority of the population, it's still very poor. It's still very dependent on a government that every day gives them less and less and less. And this is why we're seeing the numbers of refugees that we're seeing. And we're going to continue to see them further and further away.
The political persecution, like, I feel like people forget about this. And I also got it in the comments, you know, those people are lying, they're not persecuted, being poor is not an excuse. That's a lie. In Venezuela, if you go on Twitter and start talking against your local Chavista official, you are in danger, sir. So this idea that in Venezuela you can say whatever you want without political persecution and the only issue is the economy, let's not forget what's going on in Venezuela, where people are jailed every day for opposing the regime. Like, it's insane to me that we have to remind people of this. Like, it's not just poverty that's going on here.
That we have to remind people, and that we have to remind Venezuelans. That we have to remind Venezuelans, because a lot of these Venezuelans that are saying these things against other fellow Venezuelans, they themselves are political refugees, like legally. That's how they went into the United States in the first place. And now that they're saying, oh, these guys are coming after me, they're actually not political refugees. Bullshit. They're living the same life and experiences as you. If anything, they have it harder because they don't have enough money to travel in a plane to seek asylum in Florida.
And to a Republican, to Ron DeSantis, to the Texas governor, y'all are both the same. The rich Venezuelan and the poor Venezuelan, it's the same to them. So this idea that you're going to separate yourselves from the new migrants that are coming, I mean, it's so ridiculous. But also, Edu, I wanted, because I gotta mess with all sides. Yes, we point out Republican hypocrisy. It's terrible what they're doing to these migrants. It's human rights violation. But there's another part of this, Edu. Every politician, all sides in the United States and in the Western Hemisphere have to get serious about what's happening at the US border. I feel like people have not caught up to what the crisis is right now. People are used to the type of migrants that you see at the US-Mexico border are usually Central Americans trying to come to the United States to work and send money to their families. That has changed with the 3 dictatorships in our hemisphere that the Democrats refuse to accept as the huge crisis that it is. We are now seeing people from these 3 countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, at the US-Mexico border. That is one of the main reasons we have a border crisis, which we do, by the way. That's an episode for the topic for another episode. Edu and I actually have different takes on how migration should look. He's all for open borders.
Borders are not real.
Yeah.
Borders are not real.
He's an open border guy. I'm more like we need borders to have countries, but definitely want as much legal migration as we can have. But there's a crisis at the border, and no one's talking about a main cause, which is what's going on in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Why don't people talk about that migrant crisis in the US-Mexico border?
Now that we get to talk about blue hypocrisy with Venezuelans, there's something that I want to bring up. Democrats are having a feast, especially progressive Democrats, with what the Republicans are doing, because they're rightfully pointing out all the hypocrisy, all the bullshit, all the lack of humanity that Republicans are having by using Venezuelan and vulnerable migrants in general as political tools. But some of these people are the same people that when the US government, red or blue, are trying to do something to actually help end the dictatorship in Venezuela, or just help Venezuela in general, these are the first ones that are going to oppose it. These are the first ones that are against sanctions. These are the first people that are against recognizing the interim government. It's another issue in and of itself. They don't want to help Venezuela. They think that that's the role of Venezuelans and they should take care of that themselves.
Sorry, I have to interject and say this because these are the same people that didn't want us to give any money to Ukraine, saying it wasn't worth it, we're just prolonging the war. And it's looking like a good thing that we gave them money, no?
Sure, absolutely. Glory to Ukraine. They're fucking up the Russians right now so bad. It's an episode for another day. We need to have an update. We need to have many episodes, and hopefully we will have them this season. But yes, that's the other point that both the far right and the far left in the United States
have
isolationism. That's it. It's the fact that no one in the United States should care or should spend their tax money on helping the democracy causes abroad. And this is an issue. Because, as we've said many times before, if the United States leaves that position of power, there is a vacuum. And it's a vacuum that's already being filled by the other major powers, who happen to be Russia and China. And unlike the United States, and this is not an apology of what the United States has done and the terrible things that they have done in their foreign policy, but I can tell you, Russia and China are way much worse, and they do not promote democracy. We have it with Venezuela. One of the main reasons why Maduro is still sitting in power the way that he is because of the support that he has by the Russian government, by the Chinese government, by the Cuban government, by the Iranian government, and all the usual suspects. Same thing happening in Nicaragua. Same thing happening in Cuba. So both extremists, both on the left and the right, are extremely hypocritical when it comes to Venezuela. And frankly, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of this because it's not only cruel that they're using our suffering for their political advancement, while at the same time they're doing absolutely nothing to help us end it. They're doing absolutely nothing to actually help us. If they're not going to help it end it, at least help us get into your country. Give us the tools and the means to work legally and contribute to your society. They don't want anything with us. They only want us to be in the posters of the bad things about socialism.
It's so sad, Edu. And like, the word for it is dehumanization of Venezuelan migrants. You know, I was looking at that day that, of course, it was everywhere in the news when DeSantis did his Martha's Vineyard stunt. And all the tabloids that I read, I work writing news, so I'm always, looking at the Post, Daily Mail, like all the quick news outlets. And like all the first articles were just like horrible headlines, including the phrase Venezuelan migrants. And I just had this moment of like, how crazy. Like when I was born, I had a country that was good, and like that people, I mean, it had its problems. I don't have to like recap everything, but it was a democracy. It was a country that didn't really have many migrants. And I just had like a moment of shock of what we became, again, just for voting against a populist system that promised equality and delivered rampant corruption. So it is a case to learn so much from. And now we find, like, when did we ever think? I was actually just talking to someone, and I was like, when you introduce me to your family, like, do they know I'm Latina? Like, just the fact that I have to even, like, growing up, I never knew I would be an other, And, like, now we are an other, a minority. And that's just not what, like, we thought our destiny was when we were born in our country and like had our first years. So this, I know it's been said so often, but this can be you. This can be anyone needing refuge in another place.
There's a reason why we're having this conversation in Toronto and New York and not in Caracas. This can happen to anyone at any time. And that is why we're so adamant against populism, because that's how democracies die. I'm quoting a book, but that is in fact how democracies die.
And we saw it already, and now we're seeing the same tactics used against the migrants from our country. It's like Venezuelans here really were stuck on this cycle of misery, because we already saw our country fall apart, and it seems everywhere we go, shit starts hitting the fan.
Not only that, but it seems that everywhere that we go, we're no longer welcome. Like, we might be welcome for a few months, and then, oh, it's too many. We don't.
And I hate bringing this up, but I'm Venezuelan at the end of the day, so I have to. If there is something Venezuela did do right, was welcome immigrants and people who needed it. So it does feel like especially fucked up that we are now the Western Hemisphere's pest to all the countries, because back when all the other countries were struggling, they would come to Venezuela and we actually accepted them very gracefully. So
it feels like we're homeless. Like,
we are
not welcome in our own country. We cannot thrive in our own country. And then,
mind you, that's another part of it, Edu. So many of these people can't even go back to Venezuela. I mean, my mom literally has no country. Like, she can't, like, they won't give her a passport in Venezuela. You don't have this, literally, even if, like, they wanted to, they cannot go back home.
And we cannot go back home, and then we started being treated as illegal aliens. That's such a sad term to use. And that the fact that it's being used in mainstream politics, it's not being used by, like, fascists. It's not being used by like tankies who calls gusanos. Like, this is a mainstream political term, and it's calling us Venezuelans and Mexicans and Nicaraguans and everywhere else. Like, every brown migrant, we're being called an illegal alien in the United States. So it's sad. Like, we don't have a home to go to. Those who are still live there feel trapped. And once we try to, make another life in a different nation and start over, we're being treated like shit. We're being treated like pests. And a lot of this discourse comes from countrymen from the same country that we're coming from. So it's all sad. There's no silver lining to this, other than we're exporting our culture good things with it too, our music, our food. But behind that, there's so much
And our
suffering.
ideas, our warnings. I'm telling you all right now, you want to stop this huge wave of migrants at the US-Mexico border? Maybe do something about the dictatorships they're running away from. Because had you done something 60 years ago in Cuba, you wouldn't have those Venezuelan, Nicaraguan migrants turning up at the US-Mexico border today. So again, you American may think, why do I care about democracy in other countries? Well, it's knocking on your door right now why you should care. And that's just the beginning. They're just starting to get here. Again, this has been going on for 20 years. You are just now seeing the waves reaching the US-Mexico border. This will continue. And if this cancerous system of 21st century socialism spreads to other nations, that it'll only get worse. And typically, it tends to spread, as it did to Nicaragua and to Cuba. So...
yeah, I guess that's where we are with the Venezuelan situation. There is one more topic that I wanted to talk to you about. We didn't talk about this in pre-production, so get ready for it. Have you seen what's going on in Iran?
Yes. Oh my God, I'm surprised we didn't talk about it before.
Yeah, this is
Shit.
an ongoing developing situation in Iran. But the headline is that a woman was brutalized and murdered by the authorities of Iran because she was not wearing her hijab properly. Whatever that
By the
means.
morality police.
Iran, by the way, huge friends of Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. In any case, this has sparked a wave of protests by women, by feminist heroes. I don't have any other way to describe them. That are burning their hijabs. They're taking down their hijabs as a response to what happened. And I have nothing but my utmost and absolute respect for these women. Like, this is doing something like that in Iran, in a fundamentalist, terrible fascist government like the one in Iran. It's something brave, and I applaud them. I am afraid for their well-being, but here in this space we're trying to support every struggle for freedom, and this is one of them. So
yeah,
if you
I'm
don't know
so
what's
glad
going
you
on in
brought that
Iran,
up,
go look it
Edu.
up.
It's insane. Surely that puts everything into perspective too. Even like, I mean, most of us, I surely cannot imagine what it's like going out to protest and literally risking your life, as this girl was killed by the morality police. They beat her up so bad that she fell into a coma before she died. And this has awakened, well, I don't want to say awakened because the Iranian people have been fighting for so long, but you know, just like in fights like the Venezuelan one, there's waves and there are things that happen that bring the issues to the surface. And related to that, Elu, I just saw that the Iranian leader just landed in New York to go to the UN meeting. So isn't that unacceptable?
It's a fucking joke. Well, not so long ago, Maduro was also in New York. He visited, I think he visited like Harlem and the
The
Bronx
Black
and
Lives
all
Matter
that.
people welcomed him.
There you go, tainting another fight for a good cause in America, just because you want to support that fucking piece of shit. And speaking of all of this, like the nexus with Iran and Venezuela, we mentioned this in our previous season, and it would be a dream of mine to have her in the show. But you want to tell a story about her? You know it a little bit better than I do.
I never remember her name right. I gotta like...
Me
Y no lo
neither.
puedo buscar en mi teléfono. Es Namalji... Whatever, I'm just gonna... What does that mean?
Yeah, I'm gonna put it up here.
Oh! So yeah, there's actually, don't know if we discussed the second thread, Elu, but yeah, Elu and I are obsessed. We have mentioned her before. This Iranian American activist. She's a writer. She lives in New York. Basically, her whole activism is showing her hair. That's a beautiful curly hair, and she goes on the street and she dances, and that's how she teaches first worlders what's going on in Iran.
Masih
It's a simple...
Alinejad.
Say it again?
Masih Alinejad. I don't know if that's how I'm pronouncing
Masih
it. Right.
Alineja. But she is such a threat to the Iranian regime just by her posting videos of her dancing in the street with a skirt and her hair, that they had a plot to kidnap her from Brooklyn and take her on a boat to Venezuela, safe haven for the authoritarian dictatorships of the world. That's an oxymoron, the authoritarian regimes of the world. And this plot was foiled by the FBI. But Edu, I don't know if we discussed that about maybe 2 months ago. They found a person with an AK-47 outside her house again. So she has Fatah, and this is like an everyday concern for activists who speak against the Iranian regime anywhere in the world.
And this goes back to what we were saying before. These regimes, they work together. And although you may think that whatever's happening in your country does not have anything to do with what's happening in Iran, in Venezuela, in China, in Russia, it totally does. Because that's the reason why Venezuela and Iran cooperated to plan to kidnap an Iranian American activist. So if this can happen to her, it can happen to anyone else.
Also,
you're not saving your own country.
Salman Rushdie, the author, I actually haven't checked on his health recently, but he also had been sentenced to death by the Iranian regime decades ago, and a random psycho went and stabbed him on stage. So it doesn't even have to be like a planned plot by the Iranian regime. Just for them giving these calls of fatwa, they have people all over the world that can come against these activists for democracy. So yeah, I mean, hats off to anyone who dares do this, because it's even in the free world now they're getting here. So you're never safe when speaking against these people.
Hey, who knows? Maybe we'll become so famous in the future that one of us gets killed.
Oh my
Anyway,
God, no,
thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode.
And please, final message, be nice to migrants. You don't know what they have gone through. You don't know why they made the hard choice of leaving their home country. And don't be a hypocrite when you're talking about politics. If you're talking about the crisis of one country, you better be nice to the migrants when they come knocking on your door. So, this
final message, I just want to, before we close it, I just want to give this message, and I will give it in Spanish. I will try to put subtitles in here. But this message is para ti, José Manuel González, o como sea que te llames, no, un nombre genérico cualquiera. Peneco, que estás tú en Florida, en el Doral, en Weston, donde quiera que estés. Ya te lo dijimos en inglés, pero te lo vamos a decir en español. Aunque tú te creas mucho mejor que el que está llegando por la frontera del sur, aunque tú te creas muchísimo mejor por haber llegado en un avión a Miami, en vez de haber cruzado el Río Grande, aunque tú creas que tú eres la última Coca-Cola del desierto, ante los ojos de los republicanos que tú amas y defiendes y te atragantas con esa bota, tú eres el mismo huevón que la gente que está cruzando el río. Entonces deja la estupidez y ayuda a tus amigos venezolanos.
Y cuando Trump te vea, seguro cree que eres mexicano. Bye.
Bye.